The West woke up to news that Turkey had shot down a Russian fighter jet over its southern border.
С ударом, который нам нанесли в спину, пособники террористов.
Turkish military shot down a Russian warplane it claims was in Turkish airspace.
And also this has devolved into a serious blame game, a war of words.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're tracking this week. Turkey, Russia, Erdogan, Putin, and the media catfight over what led to the downing of the Russian warplane. Unapologetic, the British tabloid that can't bring itself to say sorry for a story that even its sister paper has backed down on. Beijing is on an anti-corruption drive, and China's media are not immune. And if you're Chinese, political, and online, you'll need to get creative to avoid getting shut down by the internet police. When Turkish F-16s brought down that Russian fighter plane November 24th along the Syrian border, the respective governments and the media outlets they tend to control presented very different versions of the facts. Ankara said that the plane violated Turkish airspace, that it warned the pilot umpteen times to change course. Moscow refuted that. It said that Turkey shot down the warplane over Syrian territory, that it was a stab in the back by the accomplices of terrorists. The warring narratives were then amplified in the media of two countries where challenging the official line is a risky journalistic business. Case in point, the two journalists at the Turkish daily Cumhuriyet, who stand accused of, quote, aiding a terrorist organization. They reported 7 months ago, backed up with what they called video evidence, that Turkey's intelligence service, MIT, had tried to send a convoy of weapons to Syria. The conflict in Syria is a geopolitical minefield, which is why Presidents Tayyip Erdogan and Vladimir Putin seem determined to keep a tight grip on the narrative. And all too often, that comes at the expense of media freedom. Our starting point this week is the Turkish border with Syria. Two leaders, both with a taste for ceremony and the trappings of power, both presiding over countries that were once empires, both accused by their own citizens of having an authoritarian streak and using it against their own domestic media outlets, and both now using those outlets to have this story told their way.
Türk jetlerinin müdahalesi öncesinde sınır ihlali yaptığı kesin.
Эрдоган подсел на дешевую нефть от варварского халифата, который в мире называют Даиш.
Well, when we compare Putin and Erdogan, both are very powerful political leaders, and they control their domestic public opinion through Turkish and Russian media. The Turkish media is controlled by the Turkish government. There are very few opposition newspapers, and it became almost a national cause in the Turkish media.
Putin is definitely more sophisticated and advanced media master and manipulator than Erdogan. The Russian media system is really largely controlled by the government, by the Kremlin, or Putin himself. The majority of the Russian people get information from the Russian television, and all major TV channels are controlled by the government.
Russia definitely has the upper hand here because it has a history of financing a strong and sophisticated propaganda machine. Russia is inundating with its message, and Turkey doesn't have that.
The first wave of coverage after the Russian warplane was shot down focused on the basic technical questions. Was it in Turkish airspace or not? Were the pilots warned or weren't they? But by the next day, the Russian media were making it personal. They were making it about President Erdogan and his family.
Семейный бизнес Эрдогана. Почему президенту Турции от поражения ИГИЛ одни убытки?
Moscow-based channels, including the Russian language Rossiya 24 and the English language RT, both zeroed in on allegations that Erdogan, through his son Behlul, was profiting from oil deals with ISIL.
Сын турецкого президента Белал приносит в бюджет семьи миллионы долларов, занимаясь поставками нефти со скважин, захваченных террористами в Сирии.
To back up their story, they ran with this image, alleging it showed Behlul Erdogan with two ISIL leaders. It turns out the two weren't warlords, they were more like waiters.
There is a Ukrainian website called Stop Fake that dedicates its work to dismantling RT's propaganda. So this website published one of its stories basically rebutting whatever RT was saying about Behlul Erdogan. And it turns out that it's not ISIS warlords, it's just a Turkish restaurant in which Behlul Erdogan was seen once.
There's been an awful lot of contradictory information, but when it comes to Turkey's links to ISIL, journalists, including those in the West, have already reported on this. It's not a new topic, it's just become a new topic in the Russian media. That, of course, isn't a coincidence. It started right after the fighter jet was shot down. Russian journalists started talking critically about various Turkish issues.
Both Putin's Russia and Erdogan's Turkey have brought large parts of their domestic media to heel, although there are differences in both approach and degree. If Russia has an edge, it's in taking its narrative to the outside world, in English and other languages. The Kremlin-funded RT network launched in English in 2005,
Well, very good morning to you.
in Arabic in 2007, and Spanish in 2009. Turkey's English language equivalent, TRT World, is a news website. It's running test transmissions, but has yet to launch on television. And while its followers on Twitter and viewers on YouTube number in the thousands, RTs are in the millions. Advantage, Moscow.
Russia has put enormous amount of money in launching Russia Today, now RT, as the channel that will give the Russian message to the international audiences, using English speakers, creating footage in various international languages. Turkey, again, didn't have that.
Turkey has fewer resources. TRT World's resources don't compare with RT. Maybe now, after this incident, Turkey's going to try strengthening its presence in the international media, just as Russia has done.
Journalists in both countries who contest the respective official narratives can pay the price, but the two governments go about it differently. Both have their primary focus on TV news. However, the Turkish authorities also go after critical print journalists, like the editor and Ankara correspondent of Cumhuriyet. 7 months ago, the paper published a story about Turkish weapons shipments into Syria. And on November 26th, 2 days after the plane was shot down, and just as the Russian media started reporting on links between the Turkish government and ISIL, the Cumhuriyet journalists were jailed following a criminal complaint filed by President Erdogan himself.
They reported how Turkey sent military equipment and weapons to some opposition fighters in Syria. This case is important because there are crucial questions about how Turkey is helping these opposition fighters, and according to international law, it might create problems for the Turkish government. Therefore, Can Dündar and Erdem Gül was portrayed as betraying the Turkish state. They are portrayed as an internal enemy.
These two arrests of Can Dündar and Erdem Gül are the latest in a line of arrests on very similar charges. But again, for Erdogan, this is not an exception, it's rather the rule. He oftentimes goes in a public forum and he takes the time to single out particular journalists that he doesn't like, whose coverage he doesn't agree with.
Bu haberi özel haber olarak yapan kişi de öyle zannediyorum ki bunun bedelini ağır ödeyecek.
And CPJ, as a press freedom group, has criticized those appearances repeatedly.
RT broadcasted an interview with the journalists of that newspaper.
They said watching Cumhuriyet's notorious video is enough to draw plenty of suspicion.
And it was really funny because back in Russia, there is a crackdown on Russian independent media and no one talks about it, including RT.
This is a story about high crimes, what really happened in the sky that day, and media misdemeanors. There is punditry aplenty about Russia's new czar and Turkey's new sultan, although with the media, Vladimir Putin is more general secretary than czar. Moscow has a long history of controlling the media, from the Soviet era, that Ankara does not. And on the coverage of this story, it shows. On the download now, our viewers weigh in on the dueling narratives on the conflict between Turkey and Russia.
This is part of classic Russian strategy to go for the jugular, to exaggerate, to say the most outrageous thing, which is possible because nobody is bringing either the government or media to account. But we shouldn't forget that just as this sort of stream of vitriol that we're seeing directed against Turkey can be turned on at the drop of a hat, it can also be turned off at the drop of a hat, just as easy.
The Kremlin-funded channels, Sputnik and Russia Today, are very professional and very experienced in propaganda making. And Anatolian Agency and TRT channels are just beginning to learn the craft. But of course, this is a part of the problem itself, all this propaganda making. What the Anatolian News Agency and the TRT channels do is that they emphasize Ankara's point of view in a very overt way. The Turkish opposition itself is very much, for example, under the influence of Sputnik. They like it a lot.
Other media stories that are on our radar this week. Egyptian journalists living outside the country wondering if it's safe to go home should take note of the cautionary tale of Ismail Alexandrani. Alexandrani is usually based in Turkey, where he freelances for the Lebanese newspapers As Safir and Al Modon. He'd been critical of the Egyptian government's security policies in Sinai. And when he flew into Hurghada November 29th, reportedly for family reasons, he was arrested on charges of disseminating false information and being affiliated with the outlawed Muslim Brotherhood. He's now in pre-trial detention for 15 days, which his lawyer says could be renewed indefinitely. The New York-based Committee to Protect Journalists issued this statement. Ismail Alexandrani's arrest is the latest attempt by the Egyptian government to silence critical reporting through force and intimidation. We call on authorities to release Alexandrani immediately and drop all charges against him. For the second time in just 3 months, part of the front page of the International New York Times, printed in Thailand, has been left blank for political reasons. This is what the newspaper looked like. The story was entitled "Thai Spirits Sagging with Economy" and touched on the country's declining economic performance, as well as the failing health of the Thai king, who at 87 is the world's longest reigning monarch. However, the Times' Thai printers deemed the story too sensitive and just blanked it out. 3 months ago, the paper's printer did the exact same thing over a story on the monarchy itself, which is protected from criticism under the country's strict lèse majesté laws. Last week, we reported on all of the complaints that the British tabloid The Sun had received over a poll that it featured on its front page. This week, an apology has been issued, not from The Sun, though, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation, but by another of Murdoch's papers, The Times. The headline referred to 1 in 5 British Muslims sympathizing with jihadis. Subsequently, though, the polling company that did the survey went public, saying that the headline was misleading and was not backed up by the data it furnished the newspaper. But by then, The Sun's sister publication, The Times, had also reported on the story, piggybacking on The Sun's coverage. And although The Sun is sticking to its story, refusing to back down, The Times has abandoned it, admitting that its coverage was misleading. The British newspaper regulator, Ipsos, says it will now investigate The Sun and the story. But given Ipsos' rather toothless mandate and the history of Murdoch-owned newspapers playing fast and loose with the journalistic facts and getting away with it, not much is expected to come of that. 3 years ago, China's leader Xi Jinping launched an aggressive anti-graft campaign, vowing to crack down on what he called tigers and flies, everyone from high-ranking party officials to civil servants suspected of corruption. The media industry has not been spared. A handful of journalists from outlets ranging from the state-run CCTV channels to some well-known business news websites have been arrested under the orders of the Communist Party's internal anti-corruption body, the CCDI. Some have welcomed this campaign, arguing that low salaries in the media sector and a lack of a proper regulatory body have created a climate in which corruption amongst journalists is rife. But there are concerns over the way this campaign is being carried out. The authorities reveal very little on why journalists have been arrested, and some journalists have been forced to make pre-trial confessions on TV. The Listening Post's Meenakshi Ravi now on an anti-corruption drive that the critics say lacks its own transparency and feels more than a little political.
With the New Express. Express in Guangzhou told the police.
This journalist, Chen Yongzhu of the Chinese tabloid New Express, hasn't been seen in over 2 years. His last appearance was in October 2013 on state TV, confessing.
Now, a reporter who's been held by police for the week has confessed to writing unverified and untrue stories.
Chen was arrested under the orders of the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection, the CCDI, the arm of the government that manages President Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign. Chen had reported extensively on irregularities in the finances of a state-owned construction company. Initially, his paper, The New Express, had defended him in print. Within days of his arrest, however, they had capitulated, apologizing for Chen's false stories and promising to, quote, strengthen supervision over news workers and the publication procedure. It was one of the first CCDI investigations into the media to result in a conviction, and more would follow.
President Xi Jinping proactively introduced a series of policies when he took office 3 years ago. The anti-corruption campaign attracted the most attention, and we can see that there has been a relentless crackdown on bribery and corruption, which has been very effective.
I would say that this current anti-corruption campaign is kind of unprecedented. It can be felt at every sector, at every part of the society, and from the top to the bottom.
It's been only after the 18th Central Committee came to power that big party media has come under investigation. This almost never happened before, except in 1989, when there was the media crackdown. I don't think there's a single media outlet that's untouchable right now.
The 1989 crackdown took place alongside mass demonstrations in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. Students demanding reform and an end to corruption in the Communist Party were cracked down upon, and nearly all media coverage was suppressed. In the more than 20 years since, China's media landscape has transformed. The country's economic liberalization fueled a huge growth in news outlets. And so, when Xi Jinping took power in 2012, although government controls were still in place, he inherited a cacophonous domestic media landscape and sharply increased foreign media attention. However, the corruption issue, raised in Tiananmen Square, still remained. The anti-corruption campaign Xi launched has taken on some of China's most powerful politicians and institutions, like the party mouthpiece, the People's Daily newspaper, which was publicly criticized by the CCDI in October this year for misuse of funds. And then there's China Central Television, CCTV, one of the largest state-owned media outlets in the world, which has been under the microscope of anti-corruption officials for 2 years now.
The investigation into the media is definitely more intensive than years before. After all, many senior managers in the media are, despite the media's marketization, both journalists or editors and party officials, which means all media are the party's media. Big media bosses like those of the People's Daily and CCTV have ministerial titles. They fall under the category of the party's cadre that are directly under the CCDI's investigation.
But the kind of pervasive corruption among Chinese journalists, among Chinese news media, is what we call pre-IPO extortion, which means, especially among business media, business newspapers, magazines, websites, they will extort companies who are going to the initial public listing on the stock market.
When a company wants to get listed, it must provide a complete record of its financial activities. So journalists writing about these companies have access to everything, the good and the bad. So how does this turn into an avenue for journalists to benefit financially? They use the negative information to threaten companies.
The China Central Television case was mostly during the summer of 2014, and more than 10 journalists and executives at CCTV were arrested or under investigation. CCTV is really a weird existence. On the one hand, it's a state-run central television, but on the other hand, CCTV is highly commercial. And sometimes they will take advantage of the fact that CCTV is a state-run television So when they are taking bribes or they are doing the extortion, they will feel more like powerful.
For China's media, there is more than just the CCDI and the anti-corruption campaign to watch out for. This year alone, at least 2 journalists have been sentenced on charges of obtaining and publicizing state secrets. The cases were televised. Authorities provided scant details of exactly what had been revealed. In July this year, the government passed a sweeping law that instituted, quote, mechanisms to censor items that have or may have an impact on national security. Between the increasing pressure ostensibly based on state security concerns and the anti-corruption drive, Chinese journalists have good reason to be nervous, especially since the CCDI's own transparency and accountability leave much to be desired.
In this system, nobody is clean. It's just a matter of relative levels of corruption. The media have deep connections and are controlled by officials and interest groups, so it's not difficult to understand why we have problems such as paid reporting, paid self-censorship, and paid bad-mouthing. It's all about money. The system is corrupt. Media cannot be clean. It's impossible.
Is it wrong for the CCDI to investigate the media? I don't think it's that simple. In cases of inappropriate media conduct, we have to correct them. The question is, when the CCDI investigates an outlet, how much space and autonomy will be taken away? And can this lead to self-censorship afterwards?
This anti-corruption campaign has been carried out very recklessly, without revealing enough details of misdemeanors, and that has done more harm to the journalists than preventing them from being corrupt. They are afraid of doing bad things now, of course, but they'll also be afraid of doing good things, and that is worse.
More downloads now on the policing of the Chinese media.
There are 2 kinds of corruption in Chinese media. One is, you gave me the money, I will report positively about you or your organization. The second kind is, you gave me the money, I will not report negatively about you or your organization. The lack of press freedom creates a media environment that is just a hotbed for corruption.
For the vast majority of the Chinese news outlets, I do not think the crackdown will substantially change their day-to-day news production activities, since many of them are conforming to the state rules and guidelines. If anything, they may be able to publish more critical reports on corrupt officials that are being investigated or convicted.
And finally, in China, internet users with a political bent can find themselves in a constant game of cat and mouse with the authorities. To get around the censors, they've adopted all kinds of code words, pictures, and homonyms, words that sound the same but are spelt differently, so they don't show up in searches. When discussing a taboo topic, like the anniversary of Tiananmen Square, June 4th, 1989, they'll use coded references to try to stay one step ahead of the censors. We work with an animator who's put together a collection of some of the more imaginative examples of the way Chinese web users mask their political commentary online. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.